In his first term, President Trump said Article 2 of the Constitution means he can do whatever he wants. Now, second-term Trump is moving aggressively to reshape federal government toward expanded presidential power. He's taken actions that seem designed to end up at the Supreme Court, where he may expect the court to validate his claim of unitary executive authority. So, Michael, what are the limits of presidential power?
Well, let me say clearly, I don't want the president to fail. I've never wanted an American president to fail, but it seems like he's just hell-bent on failing without anyone thinking about it. So, the Atlantic interview that happened a day ago, he said, and I quote, "He runs the country and he runs the world." He said this less than a day ago, that he runs the country and he runs the world. So if that doesn't shake you up, no matter what political side of the aisle you come from, I'm not sure it will. He wants to consolidate the three branches of government into solely the executive branch. When we think about executive orders, as was previously mentioned, I think Obama did 33 before him and Biden did 19 after him. He's done 142 in 100 days, right? And so the distinction is the two gentlemen before him and after him, they were trying to govern the country. And now he's trying to run the world, which is a different way of governing, right? So in terms of the president and his claims of unitary executive authority, we need to think about the people that he admires, the people whose worldview and philosophies of practice he wants to institutionalize in America. So by breaking with American norms, by undermining the Constitution, abandoning the rule of law, ignoring the judicial branch, eroding cherished institutions, and punishing organizations of people that disagree with him, we have to think about where he's coming from, out of the playbook of Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Erdogan, respectively. Now, when we think back, we had a vision of this psychology in the White House before, Richard Nixon, right, who was not far from this. But we had responsible public servants in the 1970s on both sides of the aisle who sent him packing, right? But unfortunately, that's not the reality right now in America on any level right now. So all of us are sort of put in a bad space about this.
All right, Bob, I want to ask you, I mean, I just threw out that term, unitary executive authority. What really does that mean?
The unitary executive theory is the most important constitutional theory that nobody has ever heard of. It was ginned up in the 1980s, and it makes a seemingly simple proposition at its core that says that the president is in charge of the entire executive branch, and no one may intervene with anything he does pertaining to the control of the executive branch. So the president is head of the executive branch. But here's the thing. A further component of this is that Congress may not intervene in executive branch matters if the president deems them within executive authority, and that the courts may not intervene through court rulings, because that would be an intrusion on executive branch powers. Now, the problem with that idea is that it runs smack up against the fundamental nature of the American government, which is separation of powers, checks and balances. And what the unitary theory does is that it covertly rolls back checks and balances. A political scientist once said that we have a system of separate institutions sharing powers. And in fact, Congress has every right under law to control specific matters within the executive branch, and the courts have ruled on executive branch matters throughout the centuries. So it's a frontal assault on the fundamental premise that powers overlap in our system.
Okay, so he says he has Article 2. Sarah, what about Article 1?
Well, I mean, to follow up on that, it's the timing of this is interesting because there's been a long-standing conservative legal movement that has advocated for the unitary executive, theory for decades. And I think they found their man, someone who naturally would like to be the king, right? Who really grabs power and sees his position as really more of the head of, like, he can command, the entire government. And so I think the marriage of these two has really worked because they've already set up a legal strategy to try to get some of these cases before the courts. And some of these have to do with the independent agencies that Congress has set up over the decades. When the president's becoming a little too king-like, the Congress intervenes and does stuff. And one of the things they've done is set up agencies like the Federal Reserve and other independent bodies that have heads that are have set terms, right? So the idea is to protect them from political influence. And we saw recently how important that is when he was starting to threaten Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve. People got really nervous by that, right? Because you can imagine if suddenly our monetary policy is being influenced by what the president wants for political purposes. So it's really important for those independent agencies to stay independent, and that's some of what they're trying to challenge in court, I think.
Okay, now, Ty, we've had periods in our history where the president has had tremendous amounts of authority. George W. Bush after 9/11, Lincoln at the beginning of the Civil War when Congress hadn't yet come to Washington, Woodrow Wilson in the First World War. So, I mean, are we all getting all hot and bothered about this when this has happened before and maybe we should just chill?
Well, I'm not ready to chill, but I am ready. But I think you're right into thinking think about the American people, that we have 250 years of imperfect democracy. And the idea that the American people are going to accept all this, and that's really what it's down to. It's down to us as citizens, if we're going to accept this or not. And I frankly don't think we will. And so I really think that, I thought Michael did a good job of bringing up Nixon, but remember, Nixon went too far, and there was a reaction against that. I don't know whether at the end of Trump presidency, whether the president will be stronger or weaker because of his actions. I think historians have a perfect track record of predicting the future. We're always wrong. But I do think that that the jury's out on whether this will make the presidency stronger or weaker.
Okay, well, we'll go to the other historian on the panel. Tara, I mean, is this different from what we've seen before, in your view?
I think it is, in the sense that when you mention Woodrow Wilson, World War I. When you mention FDR, the Great Depression. Usually when we've seen a president expand his powers beyond what is considered the norm, we have been in some sort of emergency situation.
Crisis. Yep.
There's been a crisis, and that's part of the reason that Trump keeps trying to describe almost everything as an emergency, as a crisis, as an invasion. Because if he doesn't, then the American people are going to wonder, well, why aren't you going to Congress? But as long as he can keep describing things as an emergency, people have a tendency, especially in uncertain times, and these are very uncertain times, they have a tendency to be more accepting of the president's taking on more executive power.
You think people are buying that? I mean, one of these crises was a crisis in the trade imbalance, right? I mean, and he's a crisis of we're being invaded by Venezuela, by a gang. I mean, it's...
Well, if you look at the polls there have been major polls that have come out over the last week, and all of those major polls show a real decline in his popularity. Right. And that may not affect him soon, but this is after 100 days. Yeah. If you think about what that's going to be after a year, particularly when we all know a crash is coming with the recession if we keep these tariffs, and even if we don't, the damage has been done. There are ports that are empty. I mean, we may not have goods by the time Christmas comes around. Then the American people, if the malls aren't full, then we really are going to have a problem. So I think that I think he is out over his skis, has gone too far, and I do have faith that the American people will react to this.
I would just like to add, one other thing that's going to bring this home is going to have to do with the people who have lost their jobs, retired early, took buyouts, all of those things happen. Because right now, most of those people are still able to pay bills, et cetera. But think about what this is going to look like 6 months to 9 months from now, when, whatever compensation, et cetera, has begun to wear off and people can't pay bills, are having mortgages foreclosed on. That will get the American people going.
Michael?
What I find interesting are the places that are pushing back against him now. You think about the coal mining towns of West Virginia, the swamplands of Louisiana, the Appalachian Kentucky, all those kind of places. When you see those people pushing back, that gives me some sense of hope that we may return to an egalitarian center at some point.
Can he course correct? Do you think he's got that in him to course correct? He's pretty, this is what I believe, this is what I want. And one of you guys said he's out over his skis.
Yeah.
Can he course correct, Bob?
I would just add one point about this, which is that sitting on the Supreme Court today are several justices who helped create the unitary theory. And so the notion within the Trump administration is that some of his very aggressive moves, which seem plainly against law, may find favor in a Supreme Court that has justices that help create this very aggressive theory of unitary executive power.